Okay, so in this next module, what I want to talk about is a bit about research designs and control. Um, Let me get this to be like that. Okay, so we already talked about validity and reliability with respect to measures, but I want to talk about it in terms of an entire experiment. Um, we often talk about these different terms when we're talking about a study or an experiment that you run. One is called internal validity, which deals with the question of the link between your independent and dependent variables. Sometimes there's a very direct link between those. If you're doing an experiment that's a drug trial and you're doing a placebo versus a drug, then you look at whether or not, the people that were in the group that got the placebo, that they didn't get better, and people who were in the drug trial got better, then you know that there's a direct link between the independent and dependent variables. But often in studies where you don't have as much control as you do in an experiment, you find that you're not really exactly sure whether or not the independent and dependent variable affected each other. And the example that I always use for this is the one that is, crime rate increases with ice cream sales. Now, you could make the argument that, the more ice cream that's sold, that might lead people to commit criminal acts. But that doesn't really seem like a logical thing because have you ever had ice cream and wanted to commit a crime? Usually there's a third variable involved that might be driving both of the independent variable and the dependent variable. In this case, it would of course be temperature because when it's warm out, people are more likely to be out, to be victims of crime. When it's warm out, people are more likely to eat ice cream. So this is an example where the link between the independent and dependent variable is just tenuous. Um, then there's construct validity, which deals with the relationship between your theoretical and empirical constructs. Often it's the case that, you're studying something like aggression, and you might study it by looking at aggressive driving behavior. Well, I mean, that's only one facet or one aspect of aggression. So the question is whether or not your empirical construct is totally capturing all the variability of your the empirical construct is capturing the empirical construct. And then there's external validity, which deals with how well the results of a study generalize from your sample to the population. Um, this has been a topic that has been discussed for the last 10 years or so, that, most studies in, psychology use subjects that are weird, okay? And by weird, we mean white, educated, from industrialized countries who are rich and are from countries that are run as democracies more or less. And when you think about it, like, most studies that are done in psychology are done on undergraduates. Many of these places that run the largest studies, places like University of Michigan, Ohio State University, the University of Illinois, these are places that are dealing with a particular subgroup of the American population, and and this is part of the work that I've done years ago studying Japanese and Americans, that, it's a presumption that when we do research that the stuff that we study in our laboratories will extend to all people that exist, but oftentimes that might not be the case, and we can talk a bit about that. So internal validity deals with this relationship of the direction between the independent and the dependent variables, whether or not this link is a strong link or a tenuous link. In an ideal study, that you have complete control over, you would have control over all aspects and all levels of your independent variable, and that your measure of your dependent variable would be equally perfect. But that's not always the case. Often you lack a cause-effect relationship between the independent and dependent variables, and this is particularly the case when you're not doing an experiment. Remember, in an experiment, you randomly assign people into groups. So what that does is that makes the groups that are identified as, say, the placebo group or the drug group equal in all other ways because a coin flip was used to determine who was in one group or the other group. But the problem is that when you're not doing that, let's say that you're comparing men versus women in a particular study, and you're looking at an outcome measure, let's say, um, happiness in life. Is it because they're male or female in terms of their chromosomes? Or is it because men wear pants and women can wear dresses? Or is it because men have short hair on average and women have long hair? Let's imagine that you did a study where all the men had long hair and all the women had short hair. Would they look opposite? So in quasi experiments, because of the nature of the beast, of not being able to have control over everything, in particular who gets what treatment, there are all these other things that correlate with your independent variable that could influence behavior. Imagine that we're doing a study where we're comparing Japanese and Americans in their spatial ability. You might say that differences that you observe might have to do with the fact that they are embedded in different cultures, but could it also be that Japanese grow up learning a very sophisticated writing system called kanji, where they have to really be sensitive to the spatial relations of these lines that they're drawing all the time, whereas Americans, you have 26 letters in our alphabet. So, maybe Japanese have a different kind of training than Americans and different experiences and over the course of a lifespan that makes them different in ways that have nothing to do with their culture per se, but has to do with something more artificial like their writing system. Or it could have to do with their school system, the way in which education occurs, or any of a number of the many correlated variables. Is it the fact that, Japanese eat more fish than Americans, and so they have a different nutrition than Americans do? So to make sort of strong claims in a quasi experiment where you're not randomizing is a really difficult thing to do, and that's what threats to internal validity have to deal with. Now, construct validity has to do with the extent to which the empirical constructs actually measure the theoretical constructs, you know? So, whether or not a independent variable such as Japanese or American, that may depend on whether or not the person, how long they've lived in a culture. I mean, you could have subjects who, were self-selected. I did a study once at the University of Michigan where I studied Japanese Americans or not, they weren't Americans, Japanese versus Americans. And the Japanese people were people who self-selected to go to the University of Michigan. So they already might be different from other Japanese that didn't decide to go to the University of Michigan. So the question is whether or not, calling those people, they're just like Japanese, when the vast majority of Japanese never leave Japan, to go to a school like Michigan, is a questionable thing. But larger is, whether or not, the particular tool that you're using to measure something. Right now, I'm doing a study where I'm looking at how much control people feel over their lives. And so we have a survey that we give people where they answer questions about the nature of um, how much control they feel over things that, their health, their wealth, their family, and other things. And it's 26 questions. I mean, do I think that you can distill a person's complex psychology down to 26 questions? Does it cover all aspects of the theoretical construct of self-efficacy? Another example is self-esteem. One can think of self-esteem as a general a quantity that one has or quality that one has of respect for themselves. But, some people might have high academic self-esteem where they're really confident about themselves in terms of their academic work, but really low kind of social self-esteem where they might not have a bunch of friends or they might not have a large social network. Um, they also, might have a low physical self-esteem where they might not think of themselves as physically attractive. So all of these things are if you were to come up with a survey, what you would want is for your empirical constructs that you operationalized from your theoretical constructs to measure them as closely as possible. Okay. And I already gave this in an earlier lecture, so I'll just go through it quickly. That, one hypothetical empirical construct might only tap into a very tiny aspect of a theoretical construct such as memory, whereas some other tasks, such as, a 2 hour long neuropsychological evaluation, might tap into a much larger. And it's almost like you're standing, down on the earth and illuminating clouds with either a laser, which only taps into a small point of the cloud, or a floodlight, which is going to capture the whole cloud. So this is the kind of issue that we deal with construct validity. Um, and when we talk about, the example that I used in the first day of class having to do with the excessive drinking leading to memory loss, is it really the excessive drinking that leads to memory loss, or is it something else? Maybe people that drink also are more likely to smoke. And it's not the drinking, but it's the smoking. Maybe, people who are excessive drinkers get into accidents more often. They fall down the stairs more often and they hit their head. And it's not, the alcohol that's doing it, but it's the bashing their head all the time. Um, and the other thing is that might people who have bad memory systems be more likely to drink in the first place anyway. Just think about this, is that, maybe people who drink too much because they forget how many drinks they had. And so it's not that, the alcohol is causing bad memory systems. It's more that, um, because of having a bad memory, that leads them to drink more than they ought to. So all of these things are examples of what would be a common kind of threat to internal validity. And this is where you all need to think about this when you're reading studies that were published by other people to make sure that you know, that their study is there's a solid link between their independent and dependent variables. Um, but what about threats to construct validity? You could say excessive drinking is more than 25 drinks per week enough to be considered excessive drinking. Why not 10? Why not 100? Who defines why 25 is the sort of cutoff point? Um, and is poor performance on a digit span test a good memory of memory loss? I mean, in reality, it might be more of a measure of attention, the degree to which you're focusing on the numbers that were being recited to you that you have to recall at a later point. And it also really assesses only short-term memory. It might be that the, excessive drinking is affecting some other aspect of memory, like autobiographical memory. If it's the case that if you, black out and you don't remember, many nights of your life, it might be that, your digit span's fine, in which case you might make the argument that, excessive drinking doesn't affect memory. But it's just because you're not studying the right kind of memory in that case. So, with external validity, what we're dealing with is the relationship between your population and your sample. So, if your population is every person that you aim to describe, your sample is always going to be a teeny, teeny, tiny part of that population. You know, I mean, just think about it. It takes time to have people answer surveys. It takes money. Okay, like I'm doing a study right now where we're paying people the it's like $20 for 40 minutes of doing a study. And after a while, that adds up. It becomes 100, becomes 1,000, becomes several $1,000s. And unless you are like a government, like the census, or a very wealthy organization like ABC News or something like that, it's very hard to come up with enough funds to be able to test, enough people. There's another issue too, is that, often for many things that we study, we don't need that many people to be able to make any conclusions. I imagine that you've looked at, you know, during political season where you see that they do a poll and they say that 50% or 51% support this candidate and 49% support another candidate, and that's within the margin of error. And the margin of error is like 3%. Well, the thing is this, is that, when you test like 500 people, the error rate goes down to like 3%, but you would have to test about 5,000 people to get it down to 2%, and probably 50,000 people to get it down to 1%. And often there's just not enough time to call that many people, to survey that many people. So it ends up being a real challenge to be able to make really strong claims about, you know, uh, a conclusion. But again, I mean, these companies that do this kind of work, just remember, they're making these strong claims based on 500 people. How many people vote in the US election? Something like 150 million people. So how well do the 500 people that this survey organization called represent all of the 150 million people that are actually going to vote? Okay, so external validity refers to this ability of, or the lack of the ability of a finding um, that you have with a particular sample to generalize to other populations, contexts, or situations. And as I said, most psychological research is done on upper middle class Midwestern 18 and 20-year-old undergraduates at University of Michigan and Ohio State University. I mean, when I was at Michigan, all the undergraduates had to do something like 5 experiments, and they were, I'll never forget walking into the auditorium, where there's 5,000 students in that class. So they have 25,000 hours of experiments being done every semester at the University of Michigan. It's a huge school, right? Um, but that's going on everywhere at the University of Pennsylvania, Ohio State, Illinois, Indiana. So a lot of research that's being done is being done at universities like that. And so, you might wonder to what extent these students respond in the same way that an 80-year-old bushman living in the Kalahari Desert in Botswana might respond. This is sort of a hunting gathering community called the San people. And you might wonder whether or not the findings that you get from work at University of Michigan would really, or Rutgers, would describe an 80-year-old in the Kalahari Desert. So you got to think about these things. Now, statistical validity refers to the extent to which the statistics that we use and the claims that are based on them are appropriate for the data that you collect. And let me tell you, as someone who sat on many, many thesis committees at Rutgers, and as a reviewer of hundreds of papers for journals, this is a problem that often comes up where people use the wrong statistics to test things. And often this occurs because, you know, students don't take enough statistics class. I mean, I always recommend to all of you that, learning statistics and being good with numbers and getting over your fear of numbers is something that will be a marketable skill in your life. You might not end up as a psychology researcher, but even just having experience using spreadsheets like Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, or some statistics packages like SPSS, which is a very common one that's used, that will really pay dividends. So if you have time to take another statistics course, beyond the one that you take for psychology, I would do it because it really could pay off in the end. But honestly, you already, or next week you'll be looking at my little review of statistics. I know that many of you had statistics in high school or at least a little bit of exposure to it. But going in depth into issues with statistics goes far beyond what this course is about. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds about that. But let's go back to internal validity. What are some threats? Well, some might be history, events that occur outside of the lab. So, COVID was a major thing that affected and still affects and probably will affect for many, many years the way in which people act and behave. Okay. I mean, I think that one of the things that's so remarkable to me is that, from before COVID until after COVID, is the extent that students, really are looking for more online experiences as opposed to in-class experiences. And that was something that had nothing to do with academia. Like we didn't create COVID, but it affected it. So history, 9/11. People before 9/11 weren't so patriotic, but afterwards there were yellow ribbons on every tree in the neighborhood because people wanted to show their support for, those that passed. Um, Another threat to internal validity is maturation. This is a problem for developmental studies, is that kids get older. And as you get older, you learn new things. And so findings that occur, at one point in time might not apply at a later point in time. If you're studying, crying behavior, as I use in another lecture, that, young babies cry a lot, but older children don't. So they mature. So what describes someone at one point of time might not at another point of time. And this is one of the reasons why, there's an advantage to doing studies where you just study everyone all at the same age, all at the same time, and don't track people over time. We're going to have actually a discussion about that in a later lecture. The effects of testing. You know, if you take the SAT once and take it again, your score is going to be different on both tests. So, and we call these test retest effects. Most often people do better the second time they take the SAT because they're familiar with the test. But this is true for any study that you run where you run people twice. Once people know what they're going to be asked or what they have to do, that's going to affect how they behave. Let's talk about the Milgram experiment for a second. Once you're in the Milgram experiment and you were told at the end, ha ha ha, we were all just kidding. That was an actor. You didn't shock anyone. Don't worry. Can you be in that study again? No, because you already know that it's a ruse. You already know that it's a, deception study. Actually, this is one of the reasons why other fields like economics don't engage in deception studies. And in fact, psychologists rarely use deception studies these days. It's for a variety of reasons, is that any study that makes people question the sincerity of research, in which deception studies really do, is bad for the field as a whole. So we tend not to do that anymore. Um, I'm going to skip over regression of the mean. It's not so important. Um, some selection effects. Do all groups think alike? I spoke about this before, that, are Japanese the same as Japanese that want to come to America as opposed to Japanese Americans versus Americans? And then another threat is mortality. Let's imagine that you're doing a study where you're tracking people over time. People die, they move, they get sick of you. Not everyone who starts out in a research study of yours is going to agree to be in it, a year later. I mean, I'm doing a study right now where we're looking at people over the course of a week. And we only find that about 80% of the people who signed up for the study, knowing that it was going to be that they had to do this study, if it's Monday this week, and then do a follow-up Monday the following week, only about 80% of the people that did it the first time come back for a second time. And that's after a week, and that's after us paying them pretty handsomely. They're making money. So, research is just really hard to do in this way. Um, Another threat or general threats to construct validity might be loose connections between theory and methodology. Okay. Again, you always have to ask yourself, how well do your empirical constructs measure the phenomenon represented by your theoretical constructs? Okay. Are you using the right task in your experiment or in your study to tap into all that's represented by your theoretical construct? If not, then, no matter of number of subjects is going to help you improve this situation. So you need to really be, cognizant of that. And there's also this idea of the ambiguous effect of independent variables. One, you know, is the screw you effect, where, especially in you have to be very careful who you hire to help run your studies. You know, I once had a research assistant who was less than nice to subjects. I remember being in the other room and he told someone, "Oh, don't be an idiot." And I was like, I went in and I was like, "You don't ever say that to a subject again." But like, if you say to someone that don't be an idiot, and how likely are they going to try hard on your task? Okay. They might even purposely do the opposite of what they think you're trying to test to mess you up because they're trying to sort of screw you kind of thing. So, but there's an opposite thing, good subject tendency. Some subjects come into the experiment and they won't answer honestly because they kind of are guessing at what your hypothesis is. And they're trying to sort of answer in a way that's going to be the way in which makes themselves look good or helps you with your research. And so they answer dishonestly in order to be like a good subject. A good example of that would be asking people about extramarital affairs. Okay, a good subject doesn't want to look like they've had family affairs, even though the research assistant might not care, but they might not admit to it because they want to look like a good subject. And then there's evaluation apprehension. People might be afraid of being in studies. They're afraid of knowing something true about themselves. And this is not always true for all studies, but medical studies, for instance, some people don't want to know that they have high blood pressure or that they have a marker for a tumor that makes it more likely that they're going to get cancer. So they might have apprehension and nervousness, and that could affect the degree and how they perform in the task. And then threats to external validity. How representative is your sample of the population you aim to describe? If you're trying to examine, or study all people, probably is not the best thing to just look at some subgroup like, you know, um, Asian Americans that live in a neighborhood in San Francisco, because I don't know that that is going to apply to the Botswana, the Bushmen, or, someone living in sub-Saharan Africa or someone living in the Indian subcontinent. You have to be careful about that. If your population is all humans who have ever existed, then a sample of 20 people in Psych 225 is not a very good sample. It's not enough to make broad claims about the nature of the population. Um, but of course, you have to do what you can do. And as I said, it's expensive to collect data. You know, in my study where I'm paying people I just spoke about, like I only need about 25 people. So I'm going to test around 30 people, and then a certain number will drop out. Let's hope it's be around five. And then, we're going to end up with 25 people. For some things, 25 is enough. For other topics, you may need more than 25. So you need to be sensitive to this issue. And and also consult with a statistician. That's why it's always good to work with someone who knows what they're doing when they're doing research, and especially at the early stage when you're like a young graduate student, you should really apprentice in someone's lab and really learn the ropes about how to do this. Um, and always ask yourself, how would these results extend to different participants, different times, and different settings? I mean, one thing I learned the other day that I thought was very interesting is that the word hello is only about 125 years old. And it's funny because I watched a movie that was supposed to take place in the 1700s, and they were using the word hello, but in the 1700s, that word didn't exist. It actually was invented by Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, as a means to being able to, when you call someone on a telephone, to be able to say something to them. Without, usually, what people would say back in that day would be like good morning, good evening, good afternoon. But hello became a word that, you know, um, is very new. So, I mean, if we went back in a time machine, okay, and left the time machine in the 1500s and said hello when you left that time machine, they'd have no idea what that word means, because things change. Well, actually, if you went back that far, English would be very different than it is today anyway. So, but that's neither here nor there. So, I'm going to pause this. Actually, I'm going to make a second video. So let me stop this so that we don't make that mistake of having the computer crash. So I'm going to stop